we can just go and action,
Yeah.
essentially.
Clack.
Yeah.
So here we are in the beautiful Calgary, Alberta, 415 Winterburn Crescent, southeast, and it's February the 10th, I think.
Yeah.
By golly, 2019. Oh,
It's the ninth.
it's the ninth.
Perfect.
A voice from above.
Yeah.
So, my name is Harold Priestley Thornton, and the Priestley part comes from my mother's maiden name, um, and it comes from Yorkshire in northern England. And those Priestleys came over to this country in 1904 to homestead northwest of Edmonton, at really at a little town now called Onaway, which is about 40 miles northwest of Edmonton. It's about a maybe 40 to 45-minute drive from downtown Edmonton today on mostly a four-lane divided highway. And at the time, it took them a darn full day and often an overnight into a second day to go out there with a team of horses and a wagon, or in the winter, a sleigh. So times have changed.
Yeah, definitely. Do you know where Harold came from?
Well, only that my uncle on the Thornton side was Harold. So I think he was a teenager when I was born. I think maybe a late teenager, and he and my dad's youngest sister, well, only sister, but the youngest in the family, were still living with my dad because my grandfather and Uncle Earl had left the Rumsey area where they were farming in the dirty 30s. They got dried out, and so they piled all Grandpa's belongings into a boxcar and took it up to Grand Prairie, and then from there by wagon out to a new homestead, sort of similar in a way to the Priestley one in prior years. And this would have been, I think, in the early 30s. Who was maybe 34 or 35, something like that.
Right.
And they had a farm out there that was again almost all bush, pretty well forested. It was south of the town of Wapiti and across the Wapiti River. I don't know how they got across the river in those days. Maybe they had to ford it. I don't really know. I have found the property on Google Maps, and it's a fairly well developed, farmstead looking place, mostly cultivated, but it sure wasn't in the 30s, and they left there during World War II. My uncle was, I'm not really certain whether he was conscripted or whether he volunteered, but anyway, he got out of the farming business by hook or by crook, and he served in the Canadian Army as an ambulance driver, and was posted during the time of the Allies' involvement in Italy in driving the Nazis to the north and out of Italy. And I remember that we received a little tobacco tin about this size of the ashes from the Vesuvius eruption that occurred in, I think, 1941 or 2.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Gosh.
that he sent us. So that was kind of neat.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. So you, when and where were you born?
Well, I was born in Lethbridge, Alberta, and the site of my birth has been turned into a museum.
Right. Really.
Yeah, it's a nice
Historic
recognition.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was at the time called the Galt Hospital, and now it's the Galt Museum.
That's so funny. Oh my goodness. Oh, that's neat. And that was in 1936.
36, yeah, March the 18th, 1936, and then at that time, my mom and dad were living in Coaldale. Dad was teaching there, and when the time finally came for me to be born, they didn't have a car, so they had to call on a couple who had a car. The man was the manager of the local lumber yard, and jeepers, I can't think of their names, but okay. And I guess the interesting thing was that as they were driving into town, there was a big long freight train across the road, and my mother was, I think, in fairly good stage of labor, and she was pretty worried.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Holy smokes.
So they did manage to make it to the hospital before I was born anyway. So
Yeah.
That's probably a good thing.
So when you're waiting for a train, essentially, it could be worse.
It could be worse.
Yeah. So what is your earliest memory? Do you remember Coaldale or?
I don't remember a thing about Coaldale because we moved from there when I was about, I've always said one, and the way I've said it is people say, where were you born, or that sort of question, and I've said, well, I was born in Lethbridge, but when as soon as I could manage to influence the location of the family, we moved to Calgary, and that was when I was one.
You really? Oh my. That's
So
funny.
we did move from Coaldale to a first floor rental at the site now at the site where the Holy Cross nurses' residence is now. It's not a nurses' residence anymore, but it's the building that was then, and it was on the 2nd Street Southwest. About I think it was 2204 or something was the address. I don't remember it that way, but it was in some of our stuff. But the first memory, I think, was when we moved out of that suite, and I suspect it was because of the pressure of economics. We moved into my grandmother and grandfather's house on Memorial Drive, as it's called today. It was called Sunnyside Boulevard Northwest at the time, and it was abbreviated to just 738 Boulevard Northwest, because there weren't any other boulevards in town.
It was the first.
and that was I remember that, and I remember a Chinooki Christmas morning where I was given a balsa wood glider. It was a little thing about this wingspan, about this wide, and it had a little throwing stick. You could throw it across this way, and my grandfather, who I called Pop, was out there with me, and I was busy having a lot of fun throwing this thing as a 4-year-old. And so that was on the boulevard, the grassy lawn. It was a mowed lawn between the street and the river, the Bow River. So it's fixed in my memory as something that's not unusual in Calgary. It was a Chinook. And the grass was there and brown and in dormancy, but it was not snowy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you mentioned your grandfather, so that was Norman.
That was Norman Findlay Priestley, Norman F. Priestley, yeah. And my grandmother's name was Gertrude Crowther when she was before her marriage, and I called her Ha Ha. So it was Pop and Ha Ha, and the Ha Ha thing came, apparently I was the first grandchild, and of course, as first grandchildren are, they're made a big fuss over. So whenever we would first come to see them, she would hold out her arms and I would run to her and she'd say, "Ha ha, here's my boy."
Aw.
And so she became Ha Ha.
Oh,
I don't know any other Ha Ha's.
No, I've never heard that either.
No.
Yeah, and then you kind of mentioned Grandpa Douglas's parents, well, his dad, and what do you kind of remember about them and your grandmother on that side, obviously.
Well, that's very easy to tell you about because I never knew her. She died before I was born. Her name was Lena, and she died when they were living at Rumsey, and so that's why my dad became really part of the upbringing of his siblings. His older brother Leith was not interested, I guess, is the kindest thing you could say about it, in being involved in any way like that, and so he kind of left, and I never knew him either, really. I mean, I met him a few times, but he left a lot of responsibility on my dad.
Yeah. Did your dad ever talk about his mom, or just kind of a
Not
sore
much.
issue?
Not much. No. Yeah, and I don't really know why. I think there was plenty of love and you know, good rearing and all that and involved, but
Yeah.
no, I don't remember much of her.
No.
And in terms of Grandpa Thornton, my only early recollection is that he came out of the Peace River country from the homestead, probably in 1940 or 41. So I was little, and by that time we'd moved to Edmonton, and we were living on a house on 95th Street, somewhere around about 112th Avenue or thereabouts. I don't have a slick memory of that address. And we were living there in a rental house, and he came down on his way out to British Columbia and stayed with us at least one night, but might have been more. I don't know. And so he was given the I guess the full treatment, and so he had the master bedroom, I think, upstairs. It was a little two-story house, and my only recollection is that he had a shock of white hair, which he had till he died, and that he snored really loud because we could hear him down the stairs.
Oh, jeez. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Excellent. I never checked the dates, but do you remember great grandparents, stories about them, those kinds of things?
My great grandparents, I don't have any memory of them at all. No,
Okay.
no, they were long out of the picture.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
I don't believe that they were alive when I was born. But if they were, the great grandparents on the Thornton side would have been in Woodstock, Ontario, because my grandpa Thornton, so that's Frank Emsley Thornton, he left Woodstock in, I don't know, I'm thinking maybe when he was 30, 35 or so, had some money and went to Vancouver and became kind of an early real estate developer, and then that, as real estate development can do, went sideways on him in the Depression shortly after the dive of 1929, and so that's when he had to move to Rumsey. And what I understand is that was about the only remaining asset that he had, and it was a debt that he had. He loaned somebody some money to have that property, and they went out of the picture, and so he was able to go and farm on a quarter section. I think maybe it might have been as much as a half section of land immediately on the northeast corner of what's now the village of Rumsey.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So you kind of mentioned your Thornton aunts and uncles. Could you just talk about what you remember about your Priestley ones?
Well, yeah. The Priestley ones. My mother was the eldest of 5 kids, and next to her was Uncle Art, and he was around in in my early days. He and his wife May lived in a kind of a modernistic house out in Bowness, right on Bowness Road, and I think it's still there. It was a kind of a, I think of it as sort of an adobe hacienda, because it was it was all white, and it kind of had that Spanish look to it, which was very unusual for those days. And they moved to Portland, Oregon, and Art became very successful as a Chevron special products distributor. And so he had an agency with trucks that distributed things like dry cleaning fluids and specialty lubes to customers in the entire Portland area, and he became very wealthy as a result. They had one child whose name is Joanna. No, Joanne D. was her proper name.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And she still lives in Portland and is actually a very successful what do we call them? Well,
Kind of like an illustrator, or?
yeah, she's a movie producer, but
Oh.
so originally they were hand drawn. Now I'm sure she's doing
Oh, like animation.
animation. Yeah, that's the word.
Oh, cool.
And she's actually a member of she votes for the Oscars.
Really?
She's a member of the Academy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's pretty cool.
yeah.
Yeah. And so then after art.
Okay, after Art was Dora, I think. I'm thinking Dora was
Yeah.
next. It was either Dora or Betty, and Dora was very much a part of our growing up, because she continued to live in Calgary. She married a guy named Jack Bannister, who came out of Okotoks, and whose family is recognized there with a town name, a street name, and I think he worked as a roughneck in the Turner Valley oil fields. He also, I think, was a war veteran. I don't think he went overseas though, and they lived relatively near us on the North Hill, in our second house in Calgary. Don't want to get things too confused.
No. Yeah.
Where?
Definitely. Yeah. Well, we can.
Oh, I didn't finish there. I guess
We can go through that.
Betty married a nice guy from Coaldale, Alberta, going back to the family roots, really. And
Yeah.
kind of what that was. And Ivan Myers was her beau, and he came to Calgary as a dashing young farmer. He had a Packard convertible that was very unusual in those days. We're talking about the late 40s probably. And so she was very smitten. She was a striking blonde gal, and worked in the Hudson's Bay Company store downtown. I'm not sure what department, but if I were going to make a guess, it would be in beauty products, because
Yeah.
she was just a looker and a wonderful person. And there's more to talk about them later.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Definitely.
Then the youngest daughter was Patty, and she grew up in Calgary, and married there's a bit of a theme here, but I guess it's not unusual in Canadian history. She married an airman in the RCAF, and his name was Alan Harding, and he was from Prince Edward Island. Neat guy, and very nice guy. And they moved some years later, but not so much. They still had small children. They moved to Portland as well, to be near, I guess, to be near Art, and perhaps I don't think that Alan ever worked in Art's company, but they were there just just because. I
Yeah.
guess. Yep.
Yeah, a friendly face.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so now we can talk about your parents and kind of who they were and what they did. So maybe start with Douglas and then.
Okay. Well, Douglas grew up on that farm in Rumsey, and his memories were of hard work. And the farm is on a an old glacial moraine is really what it is. So the soil was very rocky,
Right.
and that still is the case even after generations of rock picking. I'm sure there's still stones in those fields.
Yeah.
And what he remembered was that every spring he had to go out with a team of horses and a stone boat, which was just a flat platform with runners under it. And and so it had, you know, a profile maybe 8 inches off the ground, and they had to go along and pick by hand the rocks that
Wow.
were now sitting on or near the surface, and then they took them over to a fence line or to a perimeter of a little pothole maybe, depending on what was closest, I guess, and they dumped those stones out again all by hand. So those piles grew up along the fence lines and around those little potholes.
Mm.
Backbreaking work
Yeah, I
for
was gonna
kids.
say,
Yeah,
goodness.
but that's where you learn to work, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It either turns you on or off.
Yeah. And so then from there he.
Well, he was he went to school there in Rumsey, and when he finished his grade 11, he was able to, in those days, go into Calgary to attend normal school and to get a temporary teaching certificate. Went out and taught school in the elementary, well, the only school in the area, though it was in that early interval between the temporary certificate and his later when he went back to normal and got the full meal deal. He was teaching at a school that was, I think, about 6 miles away, and I believe to the west, and it was a predominantly Jewish community, which you know I don't think many people recognize that there were communities that were ethnically, you know, less than diverse, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And he had some stories about that because he rode horseback to that school and back, because I think he was still living at home at the farm in Rumsey, and of course it was uphill both ways and all that,
Yeah.
and winter and summer and, you know, tough conditions.
Mm.
And one little anecdote that I remember him doing was that he had a student that was almost his age, really, because let's face it, he was probably 17 or so, and here he is teaching kids that are in high school.
Yeah.
And this one kid decided he'd challenge the teacher a little bit, so he did something that was worthy of discipline, let's say.
Right.
Probably discipline at that time would be the strap, and I don't know all about this part.
Yeah.
But anyway, my dad did what was necessary, and so the next day when he was riding back out to the school, he had to go right past the house where this boy lived, and the boy and his dad were standing out at the roadside waiting for dad to get there, and so he just didn't know what was going to happen, and pulled up on his horse, and the father came out right close to him, and he said, "Mr. Thornton, yes, I just wanted you to know that if you ever need any place to stay with storms, you're most welcome to stay in our house."
Really?
And that's all that was said.
Wow. Holy.
So it was one of those things that he was affirming the action that Dad had to take.
Yeah.
Not criticizing.
Holy.
Neat kind of a story of how communication can be indirect.
Yeah, yeah, and especially nowadays because teachers are sort of the enemies of parents.
Yeah, they're under the gun so badly. It's
Yeah.
just terrible.
Definitely. And so from there, did he ever go back to school?
Yeah,
to get...
after a year or two, he came back into Calgary, and he was boarding with a cousin whose name was Bob Choate, and Bob and his wife, I think it was Betty Choate. I don't remember them as being around when I was growing up, but anyway, they had a a lovely home on a knoll overlooking 10th Street. As the 10th Street goes up the hill towards Sate, it was on the east side of 10th Street, and it kind of overlooked Riley Park, and it had a wonderful view. And it was kind of a neat old house. It had the board and batten thing of the white stucco with dark brown board and batten trim, and it was still there when I was going to high school. I don't think it's there now. I'm pretty sure it'll have a large modern mansion on it now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially with that view.
But that's where he boarded, and it was so very convenient. So but he first had to get his grade 12, to do that he was enrolled in Crescent Heights High School. In its very first year of existence, it had been in the Balmoral. The kids that had been in Balmoral School, which is on 16th Avenue Northwest, and the new school was built, and they moved into it. I can't tell you the date, but Aberhart was the principal of the school, and he ultimately became, or not too far later, became the premier of the province.
Right.
So he was the principal of Crescent Heights High School, and my dad designed and painted an honor roll for the kids in the school, and his name is down in the lower right-hand corner of the original honor roll, D. Thornton. And he used to joke about that because ultimately I got my name on up in the part where the honor part went.
Right.
So he said, "Yeah, but I got my name there too."
Yeah.
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 So that was
That's
good
awesome.
balance.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then, as soon as he got his grade 12 matric, he went then over to Sate, well, what we call Sate now, and it was at that time the Alberta Normal School, which was the place where you got teaching training, and he got his permanent teaching certificate.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
And then he went out from there, from having done that, he went back to Rumsey and became the principal of the school at the neighboring village of Rowley.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, and then I think that's probably a good part to talk about your mom.
Okay.
And then we can kind of like join them at the...
That's where they joined.
When they meet. Yeah. That's perfect.
Yeah, Mom grew up early on. Her early childhood memories were of Wainwright, which was where Norman was said to be the minister of the Methodist Church in Wainwright, somewhere around 1920 plus or minus, just after the war. And so he was the minister there for several years, and then he was called, I guess is the term, to become the minister in Coaldale, just east of Lethbridge, and so that's where she sort of had her high school time. Then Norman was out of a job when the Methodists joined with the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians, I want to call them Presbylopians. That's
Yeah.
that's from another story.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and
So
they moved to Calgary and had well, I know it was a rental house in Elbow Park,
Okay.
which is now a very nice area to be in, and one that we ultimately had a house in too. Um, and 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 Grandpa Thornton, or Pop,
Yeah.
Norman, by that time had been, as I say, out of a job in preaching because I guess somebody else in that getting together of the three different churches got the position of being minister in Coaldale. So he became interested in the cooperative movement, and very soon was hired to be the general manager of the UFA Co-op.
Mm.
So that's when they moved to Calgary, and so she went to finished her high school there and in Calgary, and went to normal school, and then went out to beautiful Rowley, where
Perfect.
waiting for her, but he didn't know it at the time, was Douglas Thornton.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. Do you know how? So he'd already been there for a little bit.
A little bit, and it was a two-room school, and so she was teaching the lower grades, and he was teaching the upper grades, and he was the principal.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And they probably hit it off from the start.
I would guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, just guessing, but there were probably rules about fraternizing with your fellow teachers, but so I don't know much about all of that.
Yeah.
But suffice to say that after I'm not sure how many years they taught there together, but it was maybe 3 or 4. There's some horrific stories about teaching on the prairies in the dirty 30s because there were individual school boards, and so they, in the rural area, they would be almost completely consist of farmers who were having a very bad time with drought conditions. It was the Dust Bowl days and all of that. So they were offered physical grain in payment for their services, and they were offered it at less than market price. Well, I shouldn't say that. Higher than what the farmers were actually getting for their grain at that time. So there was a discount there, and what is a teacher going to do with 100 bushels of grain?
Yeah.
Or whatever. And so anyway, they had to hold out and just say no until the guys could come up with some actual cash and pay them a pittance.
Yeah.
It was hard on everybody. Anyway, after I'm thinking perhaps 3 years of teaching together, they decided to quit their jobs, elope, and get married in beautiful downtown Drumheller.
Right.
Yeah, went there.
Wow.
and got the minister to marry them, and they absconded down to Coaldale.
Oh.
Everything's coming back
Yeah,
to Coaldale.
it all comes back to Coaldale. Yeah. Oh, cool. And then we kind of picked up the story where you come along.
That's right.
So that's
Well, along with them, they had to bring Harold and Jean,
right.
the teenagers who they continued to bring up, and they bore all of the costs of that themselves. There was no other family to help them, so it was all on them. So they had a built-in, rather advanced age, really, family, and then along I came, and then Harold and Jean, took off to do their own things, which was good.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, what kind of lessons did they teach you, and what did you kind of admire about them? I guess.
Well, I don't know. I guess they just taught me how to live a good life. They were both very religious and active in church work. My mom was, teaching, well, singing in the choirs. Eventually became the choir leader wherever they were, and all of that. And so I followed along in the draft of that, certainly, um, in terms of singing in her choir and other choirs. But I don't know exactly what you have in mind of what did they teach you, because
Yeah.
they teach you a lot.
Yeah.
But it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
not in any way formal.
Hmm. Yeah. No. Just kind of personality traits. Those kinds of things that I don't know. I get stories from my mom about kind of just the real compassion they had for everyone around them, and
Yeah.
those kinds of things. I don't know. I think those are kind of really traits that are lacking in a lot of people nowadays, and they've always stood out in my mind as just very sort of compassionate people.
Hmm. Well, that's certainly true of my parents. When we moved to Calgary and to that house on Second Street Southwest, my dad was hired as the youth director for a church uh, just north of there on 17th Avenue that was called St. Paul's Church, and it was a church that was in a basement. It had intentions to become a real church with a top to it and everything.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure when it ever got its top, but it was very later, very much later than that. So he had that interest in the youth education still from being a teacher, because he'd gone to Coaldale to teach as well. So again, the teaching business just petered out, I guess, and so he had to go to Calgary where there were more opportunities, and was able to hire on as this uh, youth coordinator of in a United Church that was probably having a tough time existing as well.
Yeah. Definitely.
And that's their sort of their penchant was people and doing good and that sort of thing, and doing whatever it took. Like one of my early memories, really concurrent with the one that I mentioned about the glider on the boulevard, was that they were the janitors for the UFA Co-op head office in Calgary, which was on the second floor of the building that the Calgary Co-op had as their initially their only store, but became their sort of main store, I guess, in later years. And the offices were up on the upper floor, and I remember going there when I was that 4 or 5 years old, and my mom and dad were down on their knees scrubbing by hand the brown battleship linoleum that was the flooring of that second floor. And of course, I remember the store so well later on when it took over that upper floor, and the offices were in a proper office building, and everything had grown and grown up and been successful.
Yeah. Wow.
So they were very adaptive and persistent.
Yeah.
They never gave up on all the tough times that they had. They never complained. I don't remember them ever complaining about their lot in life or anything of that sort. So
Yeah. So did your dad eventually go back to teaching, or?
well, not exactly. In later life, after he spent, I guess it's not not coincidentally, but he became involved with UFA Co-op.
Right.
Could it have been because he had a father-in-law that was the general manager? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
maybe a
anyway,
little bit.
out of it was one way for Papanahaha to get rid of us was to get my dad into the company and give him a job in Edmonton. So
right.
that's when we moved to 95th Street, Edmonton, and he was essentially a field man. His title was Education Director of the UFA Co-op, and he traveled basically every 5 days a week. He was out on the road. We're talking about in the 40s and 50s, and his function was to hold meetings with the local representative of the co-op. So they had some kind of I don't know whether the term was directors, it possibly was, that were area directors, regional directors. So that he would go out and he would have meetings set up with the membership and their director to tell the membership what was going on,
Right.
and to do a little rah-rah and all that stuff. And one of the ways that they got people to come out was that when he was as part of this program, he would show 16 millimeter movies in black and white, because there wasn't color until quite a bit later, and they had sound. That was a neat thing. So, it's hard for us with all pervasive television now.
Yeah.
Everybody has full color HD and all the bells and whistles. And in those days, it was a real special thing for those people in rural Alberta to come out to a meeting and see a movie. And he always had a mix of things. He'd have some documentaries, he'd have some news, he'd have some cartoons for the kids.
Yeah.
And that was enough to get them to come out. I don't know, they might have served them some coffee and cookies or something as well. But so that's what he did 5 days a week.
Yeah.
Centered in Edmonton.
I think it's his old projector screen that I still have, and I use that still.
Yeah.
So that's kind of cool.
That is cool.
Yeah.
And I still have some of his 16 millimeter equipment downstairs. A Bell and Howell movie camera that was state of the art at the time, and no sound, and it would, it's probably, we'd go down there, and if we could find some 16 millimeter film, it probably would run.
Wow.
Because it was a wind up.
Yeah.
And so, there's no batteries to go bad or anything. Yeah, it was a good camera.
Yeah, the analog age, that stuff will last a lot longer than some of the early digital stuff, because that stuff just goes wrong and that's it.
Yeah, and it becomes obsolete so quickly.
Yeah, definitely. So your sister, she's a few years younger than you. 7 years younger. So was she born while you guys were in Edmonton? Or yeah.
So I think that was a function of economics at play.
Right.
I've never really vocalized that before, I don't think, but I think when you think about it, I was born in 1936, and tough times for everybody in North America and worldwide, I guess, really, the Depression. And so they really didn't have enough money to have another kid, and so they wanted another one, and so Lynn came along on February the 2nd, 1943, and so that was a change in our lives, and suddenly I had competition for love and affection and all that stuff. But I was old enough to be a big brother, and
Yeah. Do you remember the day she came into the world?
I don't physically remember that. No.
Yeah.
No. By then there's a bit of a story, and I don't know if we should divert into it, but when we were on 95th Street, my dad became friends with a Chinese grocer who had a store just north of us on I think 112th Avenue, and his name was Robert Pond, and Robert was a true first generation immigrant. He was working his butt off with his store. He had other things going on. Later in our relationship, he was into chinchillas when that was a real fad. Chinchillas were kind of almost like a pyramid scheme in a way, but they were imported, I think, from Peru, and this fuzzy little ball of the softest fur imaginable, and they were kept in cages in your own, could be in your own residence, and his were. Anyway, over the course of their relationship, they became good friends, and this was kind of unusual in the day because Chinese were a bit persecuted, I would say. And anyway, I don't know how this came about, but Robert Pond agreed to finance a down payment. No, Dad would have to come up with a down payment, and then Robert took on the mortgage of a house that they were to buy. So this was my mom and Dad's first house that they were buying, and it would have been around about 1943 or so. And it was in the Highlands, and it was 11142 65th Street.
Right.
And it's still there. And it's a gentrified area right now. It's a kind of inner city, you know, just not too far east of the exhibition grounds and so on. It's inner city.
Yeah.
And so that's where Lynn and I grew up. I started school there in the Highlands, and we moved back to Calgary in when I was 9. So in 45, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that perfectly alludes to the next question is, how'd you like school and your education?
School.
Yeah.
I love school. You know, you like things you can do well.
Mm-hmm.
So I enjoyed school.
Yeah.
That's
it.
That's it. Yeah.
And then university. So how did all that?
That's a little harder than school, but but I still enjoyed it. And the thing that happened there was that I really didn't have any huge mission in life as to what I was going to be, and I think that's still very, very common amongst kids. It's hard to know what you might like to do without any knowledge of what that entails, you know, and I think that's a gap that still exists. I can't imagine why there isn't more of that being taught in high school as to what does it mean to be a dentist or a bricklayer or, you know, anything. There's just so much abstract academic kinds of stuff that they're pitched at kids, and they don't know why would it be good for me to be good in math? Well, you know, it's not for everybody to know algebra or.
Yeah, it should be kind of a pragmatic school system.
Yeah, and should give kids, I don't know, and it's hard for parents in their busy lives to give them any looks at, for instance, at what some of their friends might do.
Mm-hmm.
We should be doing more of that, I think.
Yeah, and even just education on this is how you pay a mortgage, and this is how you do your taxes.
Oh, for sure.
It's ridiculous
there's nothing done in terms of personal finances.
No.
In schools, and I cannot believe that still is the case here in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, so did you, I know you went down to the University of...
Yeah, that's right. So coming out of the high school system, which, as an aside, I'd skipped grade 5 in elementary school.
Yeah.
Because I was kind of like, this is not exactly a fit, but in terms of today's TV programming, it's young Sheldon
Yeah.
from the Big Bang Theory.
Yeah.
I guess I was probably a bit obnoxious being a know-it-all in grade 5, so they punted me up to grade 6 right quick.
Yeah.
So I basically missed out a lot of fundamental math things that took me a long time to catch up on and stuff like that. But anyway, I ended up going into high school a year younger than all my classmates.
Mm-hmm.
And mom and dad being teachers, they decided, because they'd seen all this work out with other examples, they decided I'd be probably too young to go to university at 17. So I remember going up to Crescent Heights High School with my mom and having a sit-down meeting with Mr. Cartwright, the then principal.
Right.
And so she laid out her thoughts on this and suggested that I should take 4 years to go through high school. And he agreed. So we set up a program that what you could call an enriched program.
Right.
So I proceeded to take Pitman shorthand, typing, bookkeeping, metal shop, which I really enjoyed. And at the end of 4 years, you had to have 100 credits to get your matric, and I got the matric because I did take Latin, so I had the second language. You had to have 100 credits. I had 149.
Jeez. Holy smokes.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I guess, and who knows? I think it worked out okay.
Yeah, definitely.
So anyway, I'm coming out of grade 12. I had no idea what in the world I wanted to do or be. I realized I could go to university and get into most anything that I wanted to. So I forget what led me to do it, but there were several people in my class at school even that went along with me. And we decided we'd go to Mount Royal College, which was a United Church school, basically a high school. And they had created this program where they were in lockstep with the University of Oklahoma to bring people into the university system with an exact fit, course for course, with the second year engineering courses that were offered in Oklahoma. So we went out of grade 12 in Alberta directly into second year engineering in Mount Royal College.
Wow.
And then we went down to Oklahoma for our third and fourth years, but they were in fact our second and third years.
Yeah.
And the rationale that people say, well, that seems like maybe you're short selling or shorting yourself on that university time, but because they were on a semester system, and the University of Alberta, which was our other choice, there being no engineering school in Calgary at that time. U of C was just in its embryonic stages and was only offering BAs and BEds and stuff.
Yeah.
No engineering. But at OU, you took 2 semesters, and those added up to 9 months of educating versus 7 months at U of A. So in 3 years, we got 27 months versus 28 months if you'd gone 4 years at 7.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an equivalency. But in addition to that, Oklahoma had a worldwide record and reputation for petroleum engineering and petroleum geology. And so I enrolled in geological engineering, which was a cross between those two disciplines.
Right.
And we took basically all of the courses that the petroleum engineers had to take, except for STEAM Lab.
Okay.
Well, STEAM Lab isn't exactly relevant in today's world.
Yeah.
So I didn't feel the loss of that.
No.
And we took in all of the courses that the geologists took as well, except for a 300 series paleontology course. Well, you know, paleontology isn't that big
Yeah.
in the big picture.
Yeah.
Anyway, we several of us were in that exact same stream, and but there were 147 Canadians in the University of Oklahoma, which I think was a peak number.
Yeah.
The years that I was there, so 2 years, and not too many of us actually finished sort of on schedule. There were others who had, for various reasons, maybe having to stay out and make some money or whatever, who picked up their degrees, you know, in due course. Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of your engineer friends were lifelong and are lifelong friends.
Yeah. There was a real concentration of us in one of the dormitory buildings called Cleveland House. I don't know, there was 50 or 60 of us in that one house, so I had two different roommates the 2 years that I was there. And first year was Alan Hemstock, and the second year was Harvey Trimble, and they're still close friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So after getting your degree, you came back to Calgary, and what was kind of the early days back?
Well, you know, it was an interesting time. It was 1957, and I'd had some work experience in the oil patch in the 2 summers that I was in the university. The first summer I was working for Imperial Oil as a they just called it the gang, and that was at Redwater, just northeast of Edmonton. And it was basically a pick and shovel kind of a job for the first part, doing maintenance kinds of jobs around the oil field. But I got to be, I was sort of promoted towards the end of the summer to be fill-in for vacationing battery operators. So I got to do that, which was a little more prestigious, or let's say more rather than prestigious, it was probably just a little more responsibility. And I had a battery or two to run and make sure that the wells were functioning properly, and that the pipes connecting the wells to the batteries were clear. So that involved some interesting times. And then the second summer, I was hired by Texaco to work up in northeastern BC in a joint venture that they operated called the Northern Foothills Agreement, NFA. And that was a geological field party, and we were surveying the outcrops in the mountains west of Fort Nelson. And Fort Nelson is still a real hub of activity and tremendous growth in gas production in that area right now. So we had a camp just off the Alaska Highway at just past mile 300 of the Alaska Highway, and we had a Bell helicopter to take us out to the various mountain outcrops that were in the vicinity, and our job as the junior guys on there, I was teamed up with a graduate geologist, but not too much older than myself,
Mm.
and me as an undergrad, and we had a 5 foot long stick with notches cut at the 1 foot intervals, and you held the stick at right angles to the bedding plane and measured up, and we took samples of any changes of lithology that was there, and put them in cloth bags, labeled and put in your knapsack, and then you went up this. Usually it was up a little gully where you could see the rocks clearly because of erosion. And so you do that for the whole day, and then the helicopter would come back and pick you up.
Mm. Oh wow.
So the helicopter was a neat thing, and was formative in some of my later interests in
Yeah.
flying. So it was kind of a neat thing.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, thank you. We've just been given water, so.
Water, water. Thank you.
God, that tastes good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was kind of, if you came back in 57, it'd be 3 years until Nana comes along.
That's true. That is true.
Yeah.
So when I got back here, I went around interviewing with some of the oil companies, and I went to some of the ones with people in that I interfaced with during the previous 2 summers, and interestingly, they all said, "Don't come here. It's a lousy place to work."
Yeah.
So I didn't.
Yeah.
So I interviewed with an outfit called Kerr McGee, and Kerr McGee was a new upstart American import coming from basically Oklahoma is where their head office was, but they were very big in actually in contract drilling in the Gulf Coast, and they had a recently discovered uranium mine in New Mexico, and they had production in the Midwest that was pretty substantial, so they decided to come into the Canadian operation, or Canadian patch, and so I was hired by them, by a man named John Masters, and John Masters became a local legend.
Mm.
So I've always taken pride in saying that I was John Masters' first Canadian employee.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and he hired me as a geologist of all things, and I guess that was okay. Geological engineer, that's close enough.
Yeah.
And I remember the first day I came in there, and you know, you're all pumped up, and here you are, you've got this great job in the oil fields, and the first thing he gave me to do was to color a map with crayons.
Nice.
Yeah. So
Looking to work.
yeah, that takes you down a peg. And and the bad thing was we actually had a draftsman too that could have done that, but I didn't know that at the time. Anyway, John was a great guy, and he is, yeah.
That's funny.
But so about a little over a year later, they came to me and they said, Harold, we've got a bit of a problem. The company's encountered problems in their drilling down on the Gulf Coast. It's fallen off, and so our rigs are not producing the revenue that they should, and you know, and a few other little things. And unfortunately, since you're the junior guy on our staff, we're going to have to let you go. So that was the first of several,
Yeah.
because it's a cyclical business, and cycles come and go,
Yeah.
and so do people.
Yeah.
So anyway, they gave me a 2-week notice, and you know, and said you're free to go. And so before that 2 weeks was up, I was hired on by Canadian Oil Companies Limited, which was then the largest independent oil and gas company in Canada. They marketed under the name White Rose, and that's where the the refinery that you go by at Bowden.
Right.
That was one of their, you know, the service station across from the refinery was a White Rose service
Right.
station, and the refinery was a White Rose. So, but I was hired on there as an engineer, and I quickly decided that that was more of my interest than the geology part. I wasn't. I would say this: I wasn't as good at geology,
Right.
and that's what you do. You go to your interests and your abilities. So, became an engineer, kind of by accident, I guess you could say, but certainly by choice. And they were a great company for a person to learn the fundamentals, because I was very quickly put into very responsible situations, particularly at Innisfail, where I was, early on responsible for 8,500 foot wells that were oil and gas and high pressure sour gas and all of the things that entails. So it was quick learning and in an intensive environment that we had discovered just prior to my coming on board. The company had discovered this new Leduc Reef there, and it was a complete outlier. It was away from all of the conventional beliefs of where oil would be found, as often happens in the world. And a very prolific field that has produced, I don't know, a lot of oil. And some of the wells are still producing.
Wow.
Some of the ones that I drilled on in the early '60s are still producing.
That's amazing.
It really is.
Gosh. So where would you like to go from there? We can.
I don't know. I can't see anymore from looking out that window.
So maybe we could discuss the interest in flying and the famous Bonanza.
Sure. Well, I guess as a result of the northeastern BC helicopter thing, I was really taken by the phenomenon of flying, flight, and seeing landforms down below you, and all of the things that people create and all that. It's just so fascinating to see. So as soon as I got home from university, I enrolled in flying school.
Yeah.
And by that fall, I had my private license. And so it was amazingly easy to do that in those days, because they still had a remnant of the World War II programs to encourage flying training. And so I don't remember specifics, but I know that I was subsidized to learn to fly, and so even though I was making what today would be very much peanuts, I was able to afford flying lessons. So after several years passed, with quite a hiatus of no flying, because all of a sudden I had children and all that, and so you're really busy professionally. I guess I had taken the flying lessons in part because I thought it might be useful in a career. That if you could fly yourself around, maybe that would be an advantage. And it really didn't turn out much to do that. I did force it a little bit on a few occasions where, I could have driven, but I decided I'd fly. And so it was kind of it didn't work out as planned. Let's put it that way. It just wasn't that useful.
Yeah.
But it led to some interesting things just the same. So anyway, at a certain time, I was I was working for Tenneco Oil and Gas, and Tenneco sent me down to Oklahoma University for a drilling course, a specialty thing that one of the profs down there had on the side. It was I believe it was a 3-week course, and so I went down and was able to renew a few acquaintances with profs and stuff. I looked up my singing prof, Joe Benton, and things like that. But in the course of that, and then I was diligent about attending all of the classes. I don't want to give the wrong impression here, but it was a really good course put on by Preston Moore. And anyway, I realized I was in the heart of private aviation in Oklahoma and Kansas. This is where, you know, a lot of the building of airplanes was taking place, the manufacture. And so I started looking around, kicking tires on airplanes. And long story short, I found a C Bonanza, which means it was built in 1952. And a Bonanza was built by the Beechcraft, whatever, Beach anyway.
Yeah.
And it's very easily recognizable because it has a V-tail.
Yeah.
Just, no vertical stabilizer and flat tail surfaces. So anyway, it was slightly used, you know, it was whatever, 64-ish, I guess, when this happened. And so I actually was able to buy it. And I had, you know, some checkout rides and so on, and after the course was finished, I jumped in this single engine airplane and decided, you know, I'm going home with it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I didn't have any idea of how complex it might be to take an airplane into Canada. That never entered my mind.
No.
And as it turned out, that was right. It wasn't really it wasn't tough to do. There was no paperwork involved. And anyway, I picked it up and headed straight north up through Kansas and the Dakotas. And I got into South Dakota, and there was this great white wall ahead of me, and I thought, holy crow, I don't know what that is, but I don't like the looks of it. I better get this thing down on the ground. And so all I had was aeronautical charts, and thank goodness they had indicators for even quite small airports.
Yeah.
And so I saw this thing, and I found it and landed, and it was basically a crop sprayer's home strip, you know.
Yeah.
And so he welcomed me with open arms, and he said, you know, you want to put your plane in my hangar? You're welcome to do that. So I said, great, we'll put the plane in the hangar. Well, that evening there came a storm. They called it a 100-year storm, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was more than that. A blizzard of epic proportions. And I don't remember the little town's name, but when I got a hotel room, and in the morning the main street was just full of snow. There was no way a car could go through, or any vehicle. It had snowed so hard and drifted in so badly. It took them 3 days to get the place plowed out. And so at the end of that 3 days, I was able to get a ride out to the farmer's place, and he had his strip plowed by then, and so we went in the hangar, and there was a foot of snow on the wings of my airplane inside the hangar.
Wow.
Yeah.
Holy. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So I got some gas, bought some gas from the nice man, and took off and headed home.
Oh,
Yeah.
And then, yeah, you were saying about crossing the border with an airplane. Do you
Yeah,
just
just
flew over?
just flew it over. Oh, well, yeah,
You'd happen to mention to me that you bought an airplane.
that's right. I neglected to mention to Dolores that I had bought an airplane. She was home with 3 little kids. And to say that I was unpopular would probably be an understatement.
Oh my
I
goodness.
started smoking.
And she took that as an excuse to start smoking again. Yeah, imagine. Yeah, I tried to get her to come down to meet me at Great Falls, and I still wasn't telling her why.
Hmm.
And so she wasn't having any of that, because what was she going to do with 3 little kids?
Hmm.
And no particular reason to do it. So anyway, from North Dakota over to Calgary, it was uneventful. It was just a
Yeah.
nice flight. And then, eventually she did fly with me, but she wasn't that much of a aviation fan ever.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. And so, what was the kind of range? Were you able to go from North Dakota to Calgary, or you'd have to stop
Probably,
before?
I don't remember specifically
Hmm.
whether that was a one. It could have been just one hop.
Wow.
I don't have any recollection of having to stop to refuel at. I might have stopped at Regina. I don't really remember.
Yeah. That's.
I guess I could look in my logbook.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
downstairs.
Oh, cool.
I've been long trips.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did take some nice trips in the plane.
Yeah. Yeah. Any stories of daring?
Daring do? Oh,
Yeah.
well, I don't know. We Dolores has different answers than I do.
That's funny. Yeah.
We I don't know how to. We went up on a trip one day into sort of north central Alberta to the Lesser Slave Lake area, and I wasn't getting the right signals on the lights to show that the landing gear were down and locked.
Hmm.
And so we buzzed the strip at Slave Lake, which is a forestry strip, and it's still a very busy airport, really.
Hmm.
And what I was trying to do was see the shadow of
Right.
the undercarriage as we went by the strip, and you couldn't see that really. It's impossible. But anyway, we did land there, refueled, and then came back to Calgary. And I took it into my mechanic, and I told him that I had a problem with this thing, and I was having to hand crank the thing. There's a little crank right behind your seat,
Right.
and 32 revolutions, and the gear was down, and then the lights would come on, and 32 revolutions to pick them back up.
Right.
So I said, I want you to fix whatever's wrong. And so they said, fine, they would do that. Well, we were due to go on a trip down to New Orleans within a week. And so without doing a test flight or anything, which was maybe in hindsight not as smart as it should have been,
Yeah.
we loaded up with another couple that we were friends with, the Camerons, Jim and Marilyn Cameron, and headed off to go on this trip. Well, we get to Great Falls, and we have to land there to clear customs,
Hmm.
and the darn gear wouldn't go down, so I had to hand crank it down. Well, that was the pattern for the whole trip. I had to help the electric motor manually for every landing and takeoff.
Yeah.
And when I got back to Calgary, I took it back to that mechanic, and I told him what was going on. And he stripped the gear were under the seats, and they're in the sort of the wing root down under the seats.
Hmm.
And here were 2 identical electric motors sitting there, and one of them runs the flaps, and one of them runs the gear, and he'd overhauled the wrong one.
Oh,
So
wow.
the moral of the story is that mechanics should be required to fly with the pilot
Yeah.
on a test trip after every
Yeah,
service.
make sure it's. Yeah.
Yeah.
holy
So they apologized.
Yeah. Jeez. Was that probably one of the furthest distances you flew
was.
from Calgary to New Orleans?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we flew down there, Great Falls to,
Oklahoma.
yeah, to Oklahoma City, and stopped, and Dolores got to see the campus, and we toured around a little bit, and then went from there to Houston, which is where Tenneco's head office was, and I taxied right up to the Tenneco hangar. They have an Air Force,
Right.
right?
Of course.
Their pipeline company was their predominant core business, and then they got involved in drilling and production. So they have all these airplanes, light airplanes and helicopters to fly the pipeline routes to ensure that there's no leaks going on. In those days, that was sort of the state of the art, I guess. Anyway, I pull in there, and somebody comes running out, and they said, "You can't stop here. What are you doing?" Well, I said, "Well, I work for Tenneco, and I just thought I'd like to see your setup here." Oh, well, he was pretty grumpy, but he finally came around and said, "Okay, all right, you can."
Yeah.
I said, "I'd like to, park here overnight or something. We're just here for the day." And he said, "Okay." And so he says, "Would you like to see the chairman's airplane?" I said, "I'd love to." So he
Yeah.
takes us in the hangar, and here's a DC-9 that was the chairman's airplane, and it had couches, and
Oh wow.
I mean, it was opulent.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was as nice as any five-star hotel in there.
Yeah. Oh, I bet. Holy smokes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You felt like a peanut.
Oh, Nana just said felt like a peanut.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess we could maybe backtrack a little and talk about Nana and when you met her.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
We met through the university groups of our respective universities, really. She was hired on before she graduated to be a clinical instructor at the General Hospital here. And so she was doing that, and she was rooming with some other girls, some of whom were classmates. And I was, I guess I was living with my mom and dad, and but had a close group of friends from OU, and so that was sort of our social life. And in the course of dating someone else, I met Dolores as I was picking. I don't know. Somehow or other, we saw each other the first time when I was picking up somebody else.
Right, yeah.
At her house, I think that's the way it went. And so one thing led to another, and lightning struck, and all of that stuff.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, she saw a good catch, and so did I.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
So I guess there's more romantic ways of putting all that.
Well,
But
yeah, but
we started dating. I guess the one kind of interesting anecdote is that I was taking out one of her classmates.
I told him.
Oh, you've already told this story. I won't embellish it
Yes.
or counteract it.
no, all right, yeah. Well, you'll have to see the other interview to get that story.
That's
so.
right. Did she tell about where we became engaged?
No.
Oh, well, I came in as the usual thing with all of these kinds of things is it comes. You work in your private life conjunction with your professional life.
Yeah.
And so I was out in the field on a well and came in and probably late for dinner, all of that kind of thing. And after dinner we got in the car and I drove up to the top of Nose Hill, which is up to Nose Hill, and it wasn't a park at that time, and you could drive right up 14th Street and on a prairie trail, you get up to the top, and we parked there and looking out over the city, beautiful lights, and it was a nice clear night. And so I asked her to marry me, and she said yes, and so that was that. That was yeah.
Yeah. And you guys were married in.
And 6 weeks later, we were married.
Oh wow, nice.
And that really made her friends mad because they'd been planning their weddings for like 4 or 5 months already, and they weren't going to get married until later in the summer, and so she was a little unpopular.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny.
But
Yeah,
when you
'cause
know
they-
what you're doing,
Yeah.
you just move and be decisive.
Yeah, just have it how you want it.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah. And then 3 years after that, you had Scott.
Right.
And then you had the twins, and I'm told you didn't know that they were twins until.
No. Her part of the story, I know she's already told it, but my part was that I went to the hospital, of course, with her, and she was a scheduled cesarean, and I thought I knew the ropes, so I sat around in the waiting room for a decent period of time, and then I went and asked a nurse, when will the Thornton baby be coming down from the nursery, so I could see it through the glass there.
Yeah.
And she says, "Oh, they're not ready yet." And that was my first intimation that there was more than one.
They're not ready.
They're not ready.
Oh boy.
Yeah,
God. Yeah, that would have been quite a shock.
it was.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we did the announcement. I think Dolores has talked about that I put in the paper in our birth announcement. Dolores and Harold Thornton announce with astonishment and pleasure the birth of twin daughters.
Astonishment.
Right,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Nana was saying that the doctor didn't necessarily appreciate
No.
that.
There was a bit of a really unintended slam.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. So I guess you guys moved out to Strathmore a bit later, but
Quite a bit later, yeah.
Yeah. So did you want to discuss between that or?
Yeah, there was quite a progression of job situations that went on after that with the cycles, as I mentioned before. Notably, the National Energy Program that King Trudeau I instituted as an absolute program against Western Canada, that rotten pot liquor. He still hated so thoroughly.
Oh, yeah.
You know, part of the NEP was the formation of Petro-Canada, and that was an idea that Morris Strong and Trudeau colluded on, both of whom are thoroughly disliked in this area. Rotten. I think the only way we can say it is rotten bastards.
Yeah.
And anyway, when the NEP came in, there was a complete drying up of the ability to raise money in the markets in Toronto, and I was working as vice president of engineering for a company called Camel Oil and Gas, and we had done some pretty good things in the preceding 4 or 5 years, and we built a company that was thriving, but we needed to get some more cash to develop some of the things that we found and to do more exploration. Of couldn't do it, so I lost my job.
Mm.
And I trying to think of what these cycles have come and gone so much. I guess I should have done some preparation to have notes here, but what happened was I had quite a long interlude of consulting. So I was doing field and project management for a variety of usually fairly small companies, not exclusively small, but usually throughout Western Canada, really. And that went on for several years.